Awesome. We'll get started and people will catch up. So welcome back, Laura. I know you're new here. I think that we'll have a few more people that are new today as well. But yeah, we're called Design for Impact. We're a community basically of change makers. Every week we have these sessions where we're learning about a new topic. This is the second lesson from our design research course, which we're running. So pretty exciting. So I'll start with a story. This was one of the research projects I was doing basically to understand what high quality care means for different people. And the challenging thing about this sort of topic is that we wanted to, or this sort of project was, we wanted to both research with a lot of people, but we also wanted to do pretty deep research in terms of like actually spending time with people in hospital, understanding what their experience is like. So what we ended up doing was we actually used a mixed methods approach. So we had quite a few sort of approaches that helped us, get the deep stories and spend time with people, like interviewing people and having listening sessions in their hospital beds and with their family members. But then we also went broad in terms of, we had a pop-up stand, for example, that in the staff cafeteria in a specific a specific hospital and like some clinics where people could, during their lunchtime just add their thoughts in. And then we also ran a survey. So I think in total we got about 1,400 or 1,500 people in total, and that was using I think 4 or 5 research methods, and that was really interesting. To hear from so many different people, but at the same time pretty difficult in terms of actually synthesizing that much data and information to get something useful. And that was a really good project. I think Terence last week he spoke about how do you measure the impact of that. I think one of the things that we did really well was part of the survey, we actually focused on how people felt right through this engagement process, which was really important to sort of, as almost like a precursor to the success of this project. Like how do people feel about this project and the way that we've engaged them in order to understand, how successful this project is going to be. Cool. Let me go to the next slide. All right. So last week, for those people who weren't here, last week we basically spoke about what is design research and why it's important. We covered as well the mindset of a design researcher and what things do we focus on more versus less. And then we also spoke about, for the teams doing the projects, how do they get started. And I think we've got almost everyone from team 2 here. So maybe you can share your experience of the first session and week. Anyone from team 2? I don't want to call out on names.
So is that for anyone in general, just to answer?
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was pretty thorough in its approach. Just kind of like trying to figure out what is design thinking. It just gave me more information in terms of how in depth it is and how it could apply, to different fields and different areas, how useful the skill can be, and just the research that's involved. And I was also impressed with the personableness of the interviews, and talking with people and helping to make change.
Cool, awesome. Thanks, Terence. Glad you found it useful. This week we're going to talk about a few different things. The first one is like, what's the goal of design research? Almost like, what's the underpinning logic, right? Like, what's the point of design research? We're also going to talk about how do we narrow in to our research objectives and like what are the actual things we're going to ask, and then we're going to cover like what are the different research methods and what are they used for. What are the strengths and weaknesses of some of them. Any questions before we get started? All right, cool. I think I'll take that as a no. Is everyone hearing me all good? There's no problem with the audio, is there?
Yeah, you're good.
Cool.
Can hear you
Awesome.
fine.
Just
Thanks.
awfully silent today. So we're gonna start by a quick question, which is, what design research methods have you tried of or tried? Have you heard of or tried? I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna send you the Miro link. Laura, it might be yeah. Join the Miro link and I'll accept your invitation. Let me just bring the link.
Sounds good.
Awesome. And if you're having trouble, just let us know.
Okay, I need to sign in first. Sorry.
Cool. No, take your time. Hey,
Hey there.
Bushan.
Hey.
We're just doing our first activity. We're reflecting on what design research methods have you heard of or tried, and what that's
Okay.
been like. So we're on the Miro. Did you get
Okay.
the Miro link when you joined, or did I send it
No,
right
I
before?
didn't.
All right, cool. I'll send it to you privately.
Okay.
Okay, I'm in.
Awesome. Sounds good. So where the yellow is. So yeah. Cool. You should see big yellow. Yeah, cool. I think you're almost at the right spot. So I'll color the board that we're doing is green. That way you know which activity we're working on.
Okay.
Awesome. What I might do is I might split you up into 2 teams. That way we get a bit of discussion going. How does that sound?
Cool.
Sounds good.
Good.
All right. Cool. The breakout rooms should be open now. So we'll have 5 minutes for this activity. Awesome. How is that team? Any thoughts or quick pieces of input?
Yeah. So I was in a group with Terrence a while ago, and he had a question about whether or not social experiments would count as a design research method.
Mm.
Like I don't know if you know the show What Would You Do with John Quinones, where he puts actors in situations and the actual people don't know that the people are actors, and like they kind of see how people would react to different situations.
Yeah, that's interesting. Does anyone have any thoughts about that, like social experiments? So I think I guess I have two thoughts. The first one is obviously it hopefully gives you like a real representation of how people would behave, and I think that's probably one of the things that's lacking in a lot of research when you're concept testing or you're testing a new idea. It's like often we just ask people, how likely are you to buy this thing or engage with this thing, and it's like people aren't very good predictors of whether they would take a specific action, first of all, and second of all, usually people are pretty nice, right? So they'll tell you yes even if the idea isn't that great. The second thing is, I guess it's actually pretty difficult in terms of like professional design research. It's pretty difficult to do that because you have to have people's consent, right? And it's difficult, I guess, to run a social experiment. Like it just doesn't happen these days, not in my field anyway, where you run someone through a social experiment and then you sort of get their consent. So and I think in academia as well, that's a big no in terms of like
Yeah.
research. So
You usually have to get consent before.
yeah, so I guess it's like, what's the what benefit do we get from telling them this is a social experiment and please give us your consent, and then running through them? Like, are they more likely to behave in a specific way? So yeah, I don't know. I wonder if those actors and stuff actually have given their consent. I mean, it's not academic or
So
professional. It's kind of like for fun and games, I assume. But yeah, I'm not sure. Any thoughts?
you're saying legally and ethically, you should get the permission before you actually do the experiment, as opposed to asking them afterwards. And then once you get the permission, then you would, view it to the public or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Every single research project that I've done, we've had to get people's consent before we engage them. Like it's the first thing that you do when you're engaging with someone, whether it's like a diary study or interview or whatever. It's literally the first thing. It's like, can we have your consent? Can we take notes? Can we record this? And sometimes people will say, yeah, you can take notes, but you can't record it. Or you like, if you're going to publish it, then I want to see the transcript of my interview before you can publish it. So things like that. But yeah, absolutely, I would say consent is like the top of mind.
I sorry, while you were talking, I remembered something. I went to this event where someone was telling us about how he conducted an experiment. He put a USB drive, like a thumb drive, on the ground, like a couple of them on the ground around campus, and just to see what people would like do with them. And if they plugged them into their computers, then they would get like a message that popped up and said that they participated in a study, and then they asked for consent as to whether or not they could use their data afterwards, because it was like a cybersecurity thing, to see if people were like just plugging random USB drives into their computers.
Yeah, that's interesting. The interesting thing is, like at my work, they send emails where, like you're not supposed to click on the link type thing, and if you do, then they tell you like you've been caught basically. And if you do it 3 times, I think you have to go through some cybersecurity training. But I think initially they tell you this is a thing, and so please do look out for those emails. But then in the email, they don't actually tell you this is a thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Just one more thing. I'm just wondering, does that tie into what we do or have today with videotaping people with their phone, stuff like that, without permission or the right to do so. Does that tie, or can you connect that into that in some kind of way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with photos and videos, you're not actually allowed to have anyone's face or side on without their consent, at least in Australia. So you can have this back of someone's head in a photo, say, but it can't be identifiable. If you could look at someone's face and you can identify them, then you can't really do that.
I think in America, it's like if they're in public, it's fine.
Yeah, right. Interesting. All right, we'll go to the next one. Welcome, Ricardo and Jorge. Please, feel free to ask any questions, but Ricardo will ask you to introduce yourself as well in some of the small groups. All right, so this is the logic behind design research, right? So there's almost like four reasons, right? And they sort of feed into each other. So the first one is like we want to spend time with people who are experiencing a problem, and that's like people who are experiencing, say, homelessness. Say that Team 2 is focusing on that right now, versus someone who's like a service provider or someone who's in government working on that problem. Right. The second, I guess, what the benefit of that is that it helps us empathize and inspire action. Right. So it actually helps us understand the problem enough to take action that we think might be, might be helpful. The third reason is that it informs our experiments, right? So because we're working in complex systems and we need to design and run and evaluate these experiments, understanding people's perspectives of the problem and understanding their system actually helps inform what experiments we run. So sort of like the project that Laura's working on in terms of that product to help people who are unemployed. They would have needed to do a lot of research in order to make sure this has some potential. And then the fourth reason is to increase our chances of creating the change that we want, right? Because I guess we're working in a complex system, so nothing is certain, right? We can't say, here's a silver bullet, and if we do this thing, we will fix homelessness or fix unemployment. So really what we're trying to do is like increase the chances of us being successful. Any questions about the logic of design research and why we do it?
No.
All right, cool, awesome. Feel free to pause me at any time. This is pretty interactive. It's not super formal. So in terms of narrowing in on our research objectives, so say, for example, we're exploring homelessness or unemployment, or Team 1, I think, is focused on, rural farmers in Afghanistan. In order to sort of narrow in onto your research objectives, you need to understand a few things first, right? You need to understand what it is that you understand, right? So you need to actually articulate, we understand this about the system or the experience of people. You want to actually explore what you don't understand, right? In terms of like, what are the questions that we have about this issue, right? Like, what causes homelessness, or why do people stay in homelessness, or what paths have people used to go out of homelessness, for example. And then the third thing that we need to do, which is actually, I would say, really important, is to challenge our assumptions. Sometimes, we think, because of our experience or what we've heard or what we've listened to, we think we have some assumptions about the specific problem and why it still exists, right? And it's really important to actually talk about that as a team in terms of, I think that this problem still exists because X, Y, and Z. And actually go a step further and say, okay, how can we learn more about those assumptions, and who else, might be making those assumptions, and what impact does that have, right? So, for example, the typical assumption with people who might be experiencing homelessness is like, it doesn't or it takes a lot to be homeless, right? And that's an assumption that's not necessarily always true. Like in Australia, and I assume in the US, it's pretty easy to fall into homelessness. So what are those assumptions that we're making about this issue? And then how can we learn more about that? Is this actually, are our assumptions almost contributing to the issue because there's this stigma around this issue?
Yeah. Any questions about those like the 3 things that we need to do in terms of like narrowing in on our research objectives?
Yeah, it seems like there could be some confusion between
Mm.
those words, understand and assumptions, because you could think or say you understand something, which seems like it could be an assumption. So, how do you know really if you understand it or it's
Yeah.
just an assumption?
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. I think the difference is whether it's validated or not, right? So obviously we know like assumptions are, hey Ricardo, it's good to see you. Obviously we know that assumptions are almost like shortcuts that we make in our heads to sort of, to classify a specific problem or a specific group of people, and almost paint them all with the same brush. So I would say the difference between like articulating what you understand versus an assumption is like whether it's validated. Like, is this actually true? And sort of what Laura was referring to earlier, it's like sometimes you actually, you end up with like almost nothing in terms of like articulating what you understand, but you end up with like 10 assumptions. Okay. And it's almost like about researching those assumptions, like, what are the causes of homelessness, and researching it, whether through that's, online research or looking at other design research activities that people have done, or going out and, testing those assumptions yourself. And then, moving them into like, okay, this is actually, it's almost gone from like an assumption to like something that we've validated. Does that make sense?
With more time, I'll get there.
Cool. Awesome. Well, the good thing, I think, Terence, is that you'll be going through this with your team. So you almost, you'll go through that process of, not just talking about it here theoretically, but actually going through that experience. Any other questions?
No.
All right, cool. Feel free to pause me at any time. So the next, so out of that, right? So we've got like a bunch of, ideas around what do we understand, what do we not understand, and what are the assumptions. Where we go to from there, it's like, okay, what are the research objectives? Like, what do we need to understand, or what do we want to understand? And then based on those, what are the key questions that we want to ask? And why we actually decide those before we talk about research methods is that you really want to understand what it is you're trying to understand before you say, this research method will be the best for it. So for example, one thing I was working on was understanding people with disability and their experience of living in different houses, right? Because like Canberra in Australia, it's a bit weird. There's houses that are like designed for people with disabilities, but then a lot more expensive, right? So they're there, but just because someone's living in them doesn't mean they have a disability. They might just like the bigger hallways or the bathroom with like disability changes, right? So it's like what's the experience of that? Of those people? Yeah.
This is one of the biggest mistakes that my students make. They confuse the research objectives with the key questions. Usually they use the key questions like the research objectives, and the research objectives they use like the key questions in the questionnaire. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's like, I guess one of the cool things is like there's almost like a one-to-many relationship, right? Like you might have one research objective, like understanding the experience of people who have disability, but then there's like a whole bunch of questions that you could ask about that topic. Right. And that's really like the idea of the activity that we're going to run now is in terms of looking at healthcare, right? It's like, what do we want to understand? What are the research objectives that we actually understand? And then what are the key questions based on that? It's almost like a tree with branches, right? The research objectives are your trees or the trunk, and the key questions are the branches. Any other questions or thoughts before we jump into the activity?
I
Yeah, I
have
have
a
a-
question.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. So I think what might make this process a little bit difficult is not knowing the target audience. For the project that I've been working on so far, our client doesn't really have a great sense of who they want to target. They just want to target somebody that provides consistent and profitable revenue.
Mhm.
So given that, how do we approach the research objectives?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that I've sort of been toying around with in my mind, and Ricardo, feel free, and anyone else, feel free to input. But one of the things I've been toying around in my mind, and that we're literally just going to cover now, it's that a research study is not supposed to be academic, right? It's like it's because it's design research, you're almost researching in the service of design, right? So it doesn't need to be like something that you create once before you start talking to people, or you start, running the research study and then you don't change it, right? This is like keeping something the same is helpful if you want to compare the data, but it's not so helpful if you actually want to take action based on what you're understanding. So one of the things that I often do is like I start broad, right? And then as I understand more about the target audience, then I ask more specific questions about the topic or the issue or that target audience. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah. I think it's the first step that's been really difficult for us. Just the research you take to understand who your audience really is before you take further steps. So I think for that first step, would the objective be, okay, identify who the target audience is? Is that way too, it just sounds way too broad to me for some reason.
Yeah, good question. So I guess because so you're absolutely right. There is a point where you're going too broad, right? And I guess the first question is like you almost have like a Venn diagram of like, we know, these people might be experiencing unemployment or are experiencing unemployment, but at the same time, there's like almost another circle of like, it has to be something that makes the client some profit, right? So because you said like the company's looking for some profit. So it's almost like, okay, you can't target everyone who's experiencing unemployment because not everyone's going to be able to give that company profit. But it's like, okay, what's almost like trying to target what's that middle bit of people who are experiencing unemployment and can make the company profit, and trying to understand, who are those people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Ricardo, you wanted to share some thoughts?
Yes, concerning this topic of to find the correct target to the research, we are doing right now a project here in the United States that we had exactly this difficulty. We started the research project with one target in mind, that was the Black users of big techs like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. And in the middle of the project, we realized that the real target was not the Black users, was the Black designers. So it's very common. We start the project with one target thinking, and you have some assumptions. And in the middle of the project, make sometimes just one unique question. It's able to change, to shift your target completely.
What was that question?
Sorry?
What was that? What was the question that shifted your target, or what was the insight that shifted your target?
Unfortunately, I cannot open the question, but it was something based on the behavior, the internal behavior of these companies.
Gotcha. Okay.
Do you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey
Who was
guys,
that? Because it didn't highlight your name. Oh, Andrew?
Yeah, just let me know. I'm trying to find where this microphone is on this laptop. So question for you, Ricardo. The challenge with that approach is with a moving target, at what point do you draw, I guess, the line in the sand saying, okay, we're not going to move the target anymore because research is coming to a close?
Sorry, the sound was a little bit choppy. I could not understand completely.
Sorry.
I can share. Can you hear me fine, Ricardo?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. So I think Andrew's question is like, because you're moving the target, right, of who the design research is for or about, at what point do you say, okay, we've moved it 3 or 4 times now, we actually need to start taking some action? Does that make sense?
We are in the very beginning of the project. So after 3 weeks, we had no clear definition of the client, what is the real problem. So we needed to start with one target, but after 3 weeks, we finally got the real target. So I think that from now on, since we have to conclude this project in 10 weeks, we will not be able to change the target again. But now we only changed the target because we framed the problem. In the beginning, the problem, we thought the problem was something, but now we see that the problem is another.
Yeah.
And now that we are a little bit sure that the problem is correctly framed, we are confident that we can keep with this target now.
Yeah, and I think that's almost like a principle for your team, Laura, in terms of like, you just have to start, right? You can't like say we don't know, so we can't take action. You just have to start with something, and then you validate that. Is this the right target, or is it not the right target? And through the process of doing research, that target sometimes moves, and that's okay, because you're almost like, you were at 10% of like understanding the issue, and all of a sudden you've narrowed in on the right target, and now you're like 50%, right? Yeah. Bhushan, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that typically when you have a time barrier, like Ricardo mentioned, you have a 10-week gap or a 10-week period or a 6-week period. Typically that happens in a consulting assignments where you are working against time, where the delivery date is set for you and then you have to deliver within that period. Now, in my experience, I've seen that mostly people take assumptions to be the goals of their research or to be the objectives of their research study. In fact, what you should be doing is create those assumptions and then deep dive into further insights, and then wait until you have a clear picture in your mind as to this is what you understand and this is something that you don't understand. I think a lot of things, and people don't take research very seriously, and that's one of the reasons why projects fail. But I think when you start assuming that assumptions are the objectives, assumptions are not the objectives. Assumptions are supposed to drive discussions. Assumptions are supposed to throw up more questions. Assumptions are supposed to take you on a certain trail, but you don't go on that trail. Rather, you just end the trail right there. That's when I think problems start coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. That I think I'm nodding because that makes a lot of sense. Often people treat the assumption as like the thing that they have to validate, but it's like the assumption just gets you part of the way there, not all of the way there.
Yeah, because there's a hurry to get the product out, right? So
yeah,
and at the same time you have to show that you've done some design research. So typically these are companies that do not have the so-called design culture or the design environment, or I would say even the digestion capacity to understand it takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of time to throw up these assumptions and have a discussion around it. These are typical companies that will say, okay, I think your assumption is right because you are an expert. Let's go with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and to sort of your point, Bishan, and I think that's probably something that connects to what Andrew was saying. It's like you're never going to validate every single assumption, right? So you almost have to prioritize your assumption in terms of like, what are the critical assumptions that we're making in terms of, who the targeted user is, or how likely they are to use this new idea, versus, like what color does the button need to be? It's like, there's some assumptions are more important than others.
So just circling back to the question that was raised earlier regarding how do you determine the target audience. I think like if I'm talking to a client, I would time barrier, time constraint is definitely one aspect of this, but I think another component of this, you definitely want to articulate the consequences of pivoting to a different target audience after a certain elapsed period of time. So maybe that's another approach that can be taken to discuss the consequences of switching audiences at certain milestones, you can almost say, of the research initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess often clients, when you're working on those projects, often clients don't want to change the audience because they feel like you've done all these research with one target audience, and then you're saying all that research is useless in a way. But I think it's about educating clients to say, actually, that research is going to get, we had to do that research in order to get to this point. We had to drive, the Toyota in order to get to Mercedes almost. We couldn't just get into the Mercedes straight away. All right, last thing before we do the next sort of big activity. So some principles to keep in mind is that your research objectives, the objectives they're pretty they stay the same, but at the same time sometimes they do change, kind of like the example that Ricardo was saying. If their target audience is one thing, and the research objectives around that, if the target audience changes, then your research objectives might as well change. Then the other thing is, the goal is to understand what we don't understand, right? That's the goal, right? And you don't want to waste time doing research for things that you can validate using other ways, because research is often pretty expensive, right? So you want to almost like have it as a high priority, focus on the really high priority things that you need to understand, rather than just researching everything there is under the sun. And then the last sort of principle there is that because all of us make a lot of assumptions, what you really want to do is you want to start with open questions and then dig deep, right? It's almost like what Bishan was saying. You want to start with those big questions, and then you can test your assumptions through those, but you don't want to start with your assumptions and not do the big open questions. All right, so the next activity, is everyone good with that? Any questions before we start the next activity?
Not here.
Okay, cool, awesome. I'll take that as. So the next activity is on Miro again. I'll color it green for you. Let me know if you're struggling with that. And basically, it's like, what are the things we understand about people's experience in healthcare? What are the things we don't understand? And then what are the assumptions that we're making? And then from there, sort of designing a quick and dirty study in terms of saying, okay, what are the research objectives? Like, what are the things that we really want to understand, and what questions can we ask about those objectives? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I arrived right now. So I see that you already started with some post-its. This is a previous activity.
Yeah. So let me color this one green and not this one. So ignore that first board. That's clear now. And you can have a look at the last, the team's work from last session to sort of, understand a bit more about the quality of healthcare and what, who's impacted and what variables drive people's experience. So, and I'm sure your team, Ricardo and Laura, will sort of fill you in, because I think we've got a few people who were here last time as well.
So these other slides, they are from the previous meeting?
Yeah.
Do you understand the one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Let's do breakout rooms again. Cool. So they should be open now. We've got about 15 or 20 minutes for this one, but take as much time as you need, because it's a really important step, before you go out and spend thousands of dollars doing research. Hey everyone, how was your session there? Any quick thoughts? Oh, I think Ricardo, you're on mute.
I think, so Abraham, for me, I think because I missed out on the previous session, I thought this one was interlinked.
Mhm.
And I think I missed some of the points that might have been discussed
Mm.
during that session.
Mhm.
So what made me wonder is what exactly are we trying to solve? Or if we are talking about the quality of healthcare, then what exactly is the problem with the healthcare to discuss the quality?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I think those points might have been taken up in the previous session. I'm not sure,
Yeah.
which would have then culminated into something we would have done today.
Mhm.
So pardon me if I say that I was a little confused.
That's okay.
Maybe the people who attended the previous session would know better than me, but yeah, that was my impression.
No, that's good. That's good feedback. Next time I'll make sure the sessions are separate enough, I guess.
Yeah, I think what would be interesting, Abraham, from a course perspective, if you're running it like that, is to number them and to see that we know that this is number 2 of a certain session or a number 3 of a certain session.
Mm.
And
Okay,
I think
cool.
we don't do recaps now. I think we should have done a recap, but anyway,
We did, but I think maybe you missed it, but that's okay.
I
All,
missed it. Yeah.
that's all right. Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Krishan. Any
Yeah,
other
no.
thoughts on how that was?
I was saying that we can stay writing post-its until tomorrow morning because the topic is so complex. And I think, for example, I remember the case of the malaria mosquito in Africa.
Yeah.
That people, they distributed the mosquito nets and people started using it for fishing.
Yeah.
So we are talking about healthcare, but it had an impact linked with the and it's
Losing
very
you.
complex.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Very complex. And I guess the point of the research is just to have a point to start from, right? In terms of, what are the assumptions we're making, what don't we understand, and then, what do we need to understand in order to make a difference in this specific space.
Let me ask you
All right,
something.
Cool. Oh, yeah, go.
Do you think that it's possible to be assumption free in a research project?
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, I mentioned that earlier in terms of like, you can be assumption free from the big assumptions, but I don't think you can ever be like we're human beings, right? We're very good at making assumptions. So I personally don't think you can be assumption free, because I guess that I'm thinking about like my software engineering studies and like algorithms. I think algorithms, like when you're thinking through an algorithm, whether you're creating it or like, thinking through it mathematically, it's like, yeah, you can, in maths, you can have, there's a point where you have no assumptions, right? But I think in design research, because it's not, so mathematical or scientific, I think it's, and we are at the end of the day dealing with human beings, us ourselves as researchers or designers and change makers, and, the people that are experiencing the problem. Yeah, I would say no. What do you think, Ricardo?
This is a good question. I asked this question because I have a LinkedIn page and I share a bunch of contents about service design. And I was reading one critic, especially from someone that was talking that the problem with service design is that they are full of assumptions. And I was thinking, so what is your approach? And he told me, my approach is systemic thinking. But even in systemic thinking, you have assumptions.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, and we last year, I think we spoke about systems thinking, and that's going to be the next course that we explore. But it's absolutely right. Like initially you start with a bunch of assumptions, but over time, again, you validate those. So it's not about not making assumptions, but it's about, you know, writing them down and actually validating them. That's interesting.
So are assumptions, by the way, very close to bias?
I think bias can come out in assumptions. Like assumptions can be an indicator that we've got a certain bias.
Yeah, I would probably look at bias as a subset of assumptions.
Mm.
Assumptions can also be a desire, you know, to go to a desired state of mind. So don't forget the goal of design is to move you from a current state to a desired state, and for that you need to have assumptions.
What do you mean by assumptions? Do you mean like assumptions about what the future state will be better, or?
Yeah. I mean, assumptions are mostly you influenced by a future state of a certain ideal state that you have always dreamt of, or an ideal state that you've always thought would be there for you when the time comes, or something to aspire for, something to
So
something
Bhushan,
where you want
you're a consultant much like myself. So are you saying that the statement of work that you sign is assumption? No, I'm kidding.
So every work that you are an innovation consultant, right, Andrew? So you know what innovation is. Innovation is moving your customer from a current state to a desired state, whatever that desired state would be, whatever it is. It's a state where the customer feels he has met success. It could be anything. It could be changing the color of the brand, or doing a redesign of the website, or creating the next iPad. I'm not sure. You know, it's upon the person, which is what I say. You know, everybody. Which is why assumptions are very important, because biases come when you are stuck at a certain level, and change comes when you assume that these levels are not for us.
Yeah.
So biases will hold you down, will create more prejudices, versus when you assume that, oh, how about doing this? Or maybe I'm just getting into the semantics of the language, but to me, an assumption is as important as reaching out to a desired state of the ideal me, for instance.
Yeah, right.
And what happens is that design as a subject will offer you the tools to reach there, versus any other field. And pardon me because I don't have much knowledge about the other fields, but while most of the fields, as Abram mentioned, will go 2 + 2 is 4, design is the only field that will take you from where you are to somewhere far away, right? So yeah, I'm not suggesting by any sense that engineering is not important. I'm saying if you set that desired goal, then engineering can take you there, because that desired goal then becomes an objective. For that, you have to assume that yes, it is going to be there, and then we can test it out. But if you don't assume, then you are basically stuck where you are.
Yeah, I think we're probably maybe using assumptions in a couple of different ways. One thing, it's one, like when I talk about like the future state, I think we're assuming that the future state will be better than the current state. Otherwise, we wouldn't want to get there. But I don't think of the future state as an assumption. I think of it as a, you know, as a vision that we want to get to.
Yeah. But it's that vision comes from something that has influenced you, right? And that something is an assumption that you can get there. There is no certainty that you will get there.
Oh, right. Yeah. You assume that you can get there.
But if you don't dream, or if you don't assume that you're going to get there, then you're never going to build anything, right?
Yeah, right.
For you to be able to describe something, let's say going to the moon was something which was very unthinkable until JFK said it, right? Even when he said it, he gave them 10 years to do it. He said, by the end of this decade, we have to go there. And that was good enough time for people to smash their assumptions, to test their assumptions, to say go, no go, to do whatever that they wanted, right?
Yeah.
So a decade was a good period for that assumption to be tested out. But let's say JFK had not said that. He had said, okay, not going to the moon because it's too far away. I don't think we would have ever built rockets in our lives. So I think a bias is something like let's keep exploring the Earth, right? Or what's the need to go to the moon? But here is a nation that was aspiring to get away from the new normal or the normal kind of vision that people had. And it said, if we go there, then it's going to create not just jobs, but it's going to create an engineering marvel for the entire world to see. So
Yeah,
that
I think
it was an assumption when he said that during his inauguration. It was an assumption, surely an assumption.
I think like I said, I think we're using it in two different ways, but we can talk about that more maybe over on Slack. So to round us off, we'll talk about the spectrum of methods. And I think, people talk about like, the cost or how much effort involved or, how structured or unstructured it is. I like to sort of talk about the spectrum of design research methods as like going from deep to broad. Deep is like, a 2-on-1 session in someone's house. Broad is like a survey, right? Deep is like, it's very time intensive to meet one person, with all the travel and just spending time with them. Whereas a survey, you just design once and you can get, thousands of people to do it. So listening sessions is what we're going to focus on next week, which is basically actually meeting with someone in their, in their workplace or their house and listening to their experience. Obviously, you still have research objectives and like high level questions, but it's really driven by them. The next one there is like in context observation, right? So it's, watching someone use a system or watching how someone drives or, watching how someone applies for, say, a welfare subsidy. Diary study is pretty interesting in terms of like, there's a few platforms now that make it a lot easier, but basically it's like actually almost cataloging in a way someone's life, right? So for example, in that example where I was saying that we wanted to explore the experience of people with disability living in their houses, we actually were thinking of doing a diary study, right? Where it's not just an interview and they tell us what it's like, but actually, throughout 7 days, they take a photo of like the narrow hallway that they can't get into, or, them trying to use the kitchen or, things like that. And then we've got expert interviews and pop-ups. Pop-ups basically are like, like imagine the pop-ups in the shopping center, but instead of, trying to get you to buy a product, it's actually trying to get you to, give your opinion or your thoughts or experience on something. Design stimulus is also pretty interesting. I feel like I kept the top ones as the interesting ones, but design stimulus is like where you design, say, like a card game, or like, and then you run, you run people through that. And it could also not just card games, but, a bunch of like photos from magazines. And it's like, what appeals to you most or what appeals least, things like that. So you've actually got stimulus that you've designed or that you've created, then you're taking it to people. Concept testing is around, exactly what it says, just testing a concept or idea. And that might be, in the shape of a wireframe or a business model or a service blueprint or whatever it is. User testing is actually testing that idea, or how the person uses that idea with, testing how a person uses that idea, like tangibly. And then a survey. I think a survey is a survey. Most people know what a survey is. And often what we do is, or I prefer doing this, I combine methods, right? So, I think it's really important, for example, to go really deep. So I'll do listening sessions and in context, a few in context observations. And then when we've actually created an idea, we'll test that with people, versus something like where the client, for example, or you want like breadth and depth, and you might do like diary studies with 10 people and say focus groups with 100 people. And combine that with like a pop-up that targets 500 people, or a survey or something, where you're getting, you're engaging with people over a long time in terms of diary studies, but you're also engaging with people over like 5 minutes in terms of pop-ups or surveys. So the last activity, I know we're a bit over time, and you don't have to stay for this if you don't want to. The last activity is going to be how would you combine the different methods to explore healthcare? And then, so to close off though, before we do that activity, next week we're going to be talking about the art of conversations and really like deeply engaging with people to understand their experience and the problem space. That's what next week is going to be. And then this week for teams, they're going to be, you know, putting what we've learned today into action in terms of actually doing their research objectives, identifying research approaches, and then actually, you know, scheduling the research. Any questions before we go on to the activity? If people have to drop, that's more than fine. Yeah, we understand we're a bit over time. But I think some people usually like to stay back and run fully through the activity together. All right, cool. Dawn has to go. No worries. All right, so before you go, if you haven't already, it will be good to get your sort of lessons and feedback on Miro, just so you know we can improve it for next time. And yeah, I'll put you into groups for that last activity in terms of refining your research objectives, and then also you know, deciding on like a few research methods that you could combine to get to your research objectives. All right, we won't take any questions. I'll stop sharing. I'll put you into Teams again. It'll be the same breakout rooms, and I'll be around. So if you have any questions, just reach out.
Okay.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Just don't forget to put the feedback before you leave, please. It would just be good to get your thoughts. Last thing, Laura and Ricardo, we've got a Slack group if you want to join. I'll put the link in